There was a singular, terrifying moment in American history when the very definition of wealth was criminalized. A swift stroke of a pen, a single executive order, transformed millions of law-abiding citizens into felons overnight. Their physical gold, their hard-earned savings, and their financial independence were all summarily seized, ostensibly in the name of economic stability. Most people today dismiss the possibility of such an event recurring. Yet, the precise warning signs that preceded the 1930s crisis are flashing again, and this time, the impending monetary upheaval threatens to be global in scale. The clock started ticking on April 5, 1933. On that day, a fateful directive was delivered to banks, post offices, and federal institutions throughout America, Executive Order 6102, personally signed by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The directive was starkly simple: all persons residing in the United States were required to deliver all forms of gold, coin, bullion, and certificates to a Federal Reserve Bank or its member branches by May 1, 1933. This afforded citizens a mere 26 days to fully comply and surrender their assets. The compensation offered by the government was fixed at $20.67 per ounce. Refusal to comply carried severe consequences: a potential 10-year prison sentence and a steep $10,000 fine, a sum equivalent to roughly $230,000 in today's money. The order explicitly and brutally prohibited gold hoarding, effectively criminalizing the ownership of private wealth. Lifelong savers who had entrusted their wealth to gold were given approximately 3 weeks to hand it over. Every ounce, whether gold coins, heavy bars, or paper certificates, was mandated for surrender to the federal authority. Narrow exemptions were granted for rare or numismatic coins, gold used for industrial processes, and personal jewelry. But beyond these specific categories, all private gold holdings vanished, marking a massive, state-sponsored confiscation of citizen wealth. However, there is a critical detail frequently omitted from standard history curricula: after coercing Americans to relinquish their gold at $20.67 per ounce, the government dramatically revalued the price to $35 per ounce via the Gold Reserve Act in January 1934, just 9 months later. Consider the implication of this maneuver. Citizens were legally compelled to sell their assets at $20.67, only for the government, less than a year later, to declare the exact same asset was worth $35, representing a staggering 69% increase in value. The government confiscated gold at a forcibly low price, then instantaneously revalued it significantly higher. This mechanism engineered a clear 40% wealth transfer, moving purchasing power directly from the citizenry to the state. If you possessed $100,000 worth of gold before the order, you received $100,000 in paper currency. But the moment it was transferred to the Treasury, that physical gold was instantly revalued to $169,000. This action transcended mere economic policy; it was theft on a national scale, cloaked and executed through the framework of law. Crucially, it succeeded because the overwhelming majority of Americans complied. Some chose to hide their assets and risk imprisonment, but the majority obeyed because the alternative was a decade in federal prison and absolute financial ruin. The government had criminalized the ownership of money itself. For over 4 decades, from 1933 until 1974, private gold ownership was prohibited in the United States. Citizens were free to hold stocks, bonds, real estate, or even depreciating paper dollars, yet they were barred from holding the one asset that had served reliably as money for 5,000 years. This isolation of gold ownership was not a uniquely American phenomenon. Throughout the 20th century, Britain, France, and Germany all implemented similar restrictions or outright confiscations. Nearly every major Western government executed some variation of this maneuver. We will now examine the mechanics of the 1933 confiscation, the motivations behind Roosevelt's order, the exact means by which the government profited from the subsequent revaluation, the 4 predictable stages that every gold confiscation follows, the list of other nations that seized assets from their citizenry, why modern governments are likely to attempt this again using novel, non-physical mechanisms, and what this historical pattern ultimately reveals about severe monetary crises and centralized government responses. Understanding the 1933 gold seizure is not merely an academic exercise in history, it is essential for recognizing the operational playbook governments deploy when a monetary system verges on collapse. The precise economic conditions that precipitated the 1933 order are rapidly reforming today: a staggering $36 trillion in U.S. national debt, central banks paralyzed and unable to raise interest rates without triggering systemic failure, and a populace that remains dangerously convinced that paper assets constitute true wealth. Allow me to illustrate precisely what transpired in 1933, who benefited most, and why this predatory cycle is poised to repeat itself. Prior to April 1933, gold was not just a commodity, it was considered the only genuine form of money. The US dollar functioned merely as a negotiable claim on gold. Any citizen could walk into a bank and demand exchange of their paper dollars for physical gold coins at the fixed rate of $20.67 per ounce. This mechanism was not symbolic, it was the bedrock of the entire global monetary system. The United States, like almost all industrialized nations, operated under a formal gold standard, meaning every dollar in circulation was theoretically backed by physical gold reserves held by the Treasury. The immense benefit of the gold standard was the fiscal discipline it imposed on government spending. If the state desired greater expenditure, it was first required to secure more physical gold. Crucially, the government could not simply print money without corresponding gold reserves, severely limiting its power to inflate the currency and debase the dollar. For citizens, this provided a vital layer of wealth protection. If they saved $1,000 in gold coins, they possessed 48.3 ounces, and the value of that metal was immutable. Gold was gold, and governments could not debase it. But by the late 1920s, the American economy had become dangerously overextended. Rampant stock market speculation propelled prices to fundamentally unsustainable levels. Credit was readily available, and debt permeated every sector. The inevitable correction arrived on October 29, 1929, when the stock market catastrophically crashed. The Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted 25% within just 2 days. Banks that had heavily financed this speculation incurred staggering losses, triggering the first wave of devastating bank runs. Between 1929 and 1933, a shocking collapse saw over 9,000 banks fail, approximately 40% of all U.S. financial institutions. Millions of depositors were wiped out. Consequently, those who retained any liquidity rapidly lost faith in both the fractional reserve banking system and the unsecured paper dollar. They urgently demanded gold. As masses rushed to banks demanding to exchange their paper currency for physical gold coins, a severe crisis developed for the federal government. Universal conversion would quickly deplete the Treasury's gold reserves, causing the gold backing to vanish and resulting in the immediate collapse of the dollar. The Federal Reserve, established in 1913, initially attempted to staunch the gold outflow by aggressively raising interest rates. However, these punitive rates only exacerbated the depression, stifling borrowing and spiking unemployment to 25%. Wealthy Americans, sensing disaster, began shipping their gold overseas to shield it from potential government seizure. By the time Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated in March 1933, the banking system was in total meltdown, and gold was flowing rapidly overseas. Roosevelt faced a profound ideological choice: either allow the gold standard to function organically, which would compel the government to exercise fiscal restraint and halt inflationary money printing, or dismantle the gold standard entirely, seize the nation's gold, and grant the government unfettered, unlimited authority to print and spend. He decisively chose confiscation. Just 2 days after his inauguration, on March 6, 1933, Roosevelt declared a national banking holiday, shuttering every bank in America. For 4 agonizing days, citizens were locked out of their own money. Congress swiftly passed the Emergency Banking Act on March 9, granting the president sweeping powers over banking transactions and foreign exchange. Then, on April 5, 1933, the infamous Executive Order 6102 was issued, mandating that all private gold holdings be surrendered by May 1. The language of the order was extremely specific. Section 2 legally mandated that all persons are hereby required to deliver on or before May 1, 1933 to a Federal Reserve Bank or branch or agency thereof, or to any member bank of the Federal Reserve System, all gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates now owned by them. The penalties were equally clear. Section 9 stipulated that whoever willfully violates any provision of this executive order may be fined not more than $10,000, or if a natural person may be imprisoned for not more than 10 years, or both. The government gave Americans 26 days to surrender their gold or face a decade in federal prison. The order did include exemptions. You were permitted to keep up to $100 in gold coins, roughly 5 ounces, and gold used for arts, industry, or profession. Crucially, the exemption for rare and unusual coins with recognized special value to collectors provided a significant loophole. The $100 exemption was intentionally minimal. It permitted citizens to retain only a small amount of pocket change, forcing the surrender of any substantive gold savings. This rare coin loophole allowed wealthy collectors to legally bypass the mandate by reclassifying their holdings as numismatic collectibles. Ordinary citizens holding common bullion coins, however, enjoyed no such protection. The penalty was extreme, a $10,000 fine, worth $230,000 today, and 10 years in prison. The government achieved widespread compliance primarily through the mechanism of fear. While the Treasury officially reported that 21.9% of estimated privately held gold was relinquished, totaling over 300 tons of assets confiscated from U.S. citizens, this figure is highly misleading. It only accounts for gold that was officially declared. Anecdotal evidence suggests large amounts were secretly hoarded, buried, shipped overseas, or retained under the pretense of being rare collectibles. Nevertheless, the majority obeyed, finding the consequences too severe to risk. Here is what transpired if you complied. You entered the bank premises carrying gold, a time-tested, tangible form of money. The bank weighed the metal and paid you $20.67 per ounce in paper dollars. You exited holding mere paper, a promise subject to the government's future actions. 9 months after the confiscation, on January 30, 1934, Congress formalized the state's profit by passing the Gold Reserve Act. This consequential legislation accomplished two primary objectives. First, it formally transferred the title and ownership of all monetary gold reserves from the Federal Reserve directly to the U.S. Treasury. Second, and more critically, it officially revalued gold, lifting the price from $20.67 per ounce to $35.00 per ounce. This single stroke represented an instantaneous 69% increase in gold's official price, which was mathematically equivalent to a 40% devaluation of the dollar. Think about the implications. In April 1933, you were forced to sell your gold for $20.67 per ounce. In January 1934, the government declared that same gold was worth $35 per ounce. If you had turned in 100 ounces of gold, you received $2,067. But the government now valued that gold at $3,500. While the government profited by $14.33 per ounce, the citizen lost $14.33 in real purchasing power. This constituted a massive, engineered wealth transfer. Before 1934, the government could only issue $20.67 in currency for every ounce of gold. After the revaluation to $35, that exact same ounce could now legally back $35 million in currency. By simply changing a number on a ledger, the government inflated the money supply by 69% without acquiring a single additional ounce of gold. This was a true monetary expansion by official decree. Crucially, by stripping Americans of their gold, the government simultaneously removed the primary hedge against the inflation that was soon to follow. From 1934 through 1945, the government dramatically expanded the money supply to finance both the costly New Deal programs and the immense effort of World War II. Predictably, inflation ensued, prices soared, and the purchasing power of the dollar steadily eroded. Had citizens retained their gold, they would have been protected, but ownership was prohibited. They were forced to hold paper dollars that lost value every year. This illustrates the full mechanism of confiscation: seize the gold, revalue it dramatically higher, utilize this new valuation to print vast quantities of money, inflate the currency, and thus systematically transfer wealth from the population to the state. Now, let me show you the 4 stages every gold confiscation follows, because this predictable pattern has repeated itself throughout history. Stage 1: Engineer or exploit a crisis. Gold confiscations are never implemented during periods of stability. They exclusively occur during acute economic crises when the government desperately requires a public justification. In 1933, the pretense was the Great Depression, bank failures, and the collapsing economy. The administration framed the seizure as absolutely necessary to stabilize the banking system and facilitate economic recovery. The underlying truth, however, was that the government required the gold to break free from the gold standard constraint and obtain unlimited monetary printing power. The public accepted the necessity because the crisis provided perfect political cover. Every historical gold seizure has followed a moment of chaos, economic collapse, warfare, or hyperinflation. Stage 2, criminalize ownership. The state does not approach citizens with a polite request or offer fair market value. Instead, it weaponizes the legal system, criminalizing ownership and demanding surrender under the explicit threat of severe imprisonment. Executive Order 6102 instantly rendered gold hoarding illegal. Owning a sum exceeding $100 in gold coins became a serious crime, punishable by a decade in federal prison. This action turned law-abiding citizens into felons overnight. Fear was the enforcing mechanism, ensuring widespread compliance. Stage 3, pay a substantially below market price. When the government executes a confiscation, it always dictates the price, it never adheres to genuine market valuation. In 1933, the payment was fixed at $20.67 per ounce. The rapid 69% revaluation 9 months later proves conclusively that the actual market value was closer to $35 all along. Wealthy Americans who shipped their gold overseas before the order clearly understood the government intended to underpay. Citizens received $20.67, the state immediately valued the asset at $35. This constitutes not compensation, but calculated financial theft. Stage 4, revalue and monetize the profit. Following the seizure, the government instantly revalues the asset higher to realize a massive institutional profit and monetize the loss inflicted upon the populace. The Gold Reserve Act moved the price from $20.67 to $35. The government acquired zero new gold, yet it unilaterally declared its existing holdings were worth significantly more, instantly expanding the nation's credit and money supply by 69%. The citizens who surrendered their assets never saw the benefit of this revaluation. They received $20.67 and were simply told they had served the national interest. The 1933 U.S. event was not an anomaly, other nations adhered to the same pattern. In 1966, the UK banned private ownership of gold bullion under the Exchange Control Act, forcing British citizens to forego this inflation hedge for 5 years until 1971 while the pound sterling suffered devaluation. France repeatedly restricted gold ownership throughout the 20th century, notably discouraging hoarding after World War I to prop up the franc. Most notoriously, Nazi Germany systematically confiscated gold from Jewish citizens and political opponents, channeling these assets through the Reichsbank to finance its national security and war machine. Post-revolution, the Soviet Union completely outlawed private gold ownership, declaring all gold assets the exclusive property of the state. Even Australia imposed severe restrictions from 1959 to 1976, requiring permission from the Reserve Bank to hold more than a minimal amount. The trend is clear: when governments face profound monetary crises, they seize or restrict gold to maintain absolute control over the currency and fund escalating state expenditures. And critically, once governments consolidate control over gold, they rarely relinquish it quickly. The U.S. prohibition persisted for 41 long years. Why? Because the government aimed to eliminate competition for the paper dollar. As long as gold was illegal, Americans were forced into holding dollars, treasury bonds, and other paper assets, preventing them from escaping inflation by fleeing to gold. The government inflated substantially to finance World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. The true shift occurred in 1971 when President Nixon unilaterally closed the gold window, terminating the international convertibility of the dollar to gold. This move represented the final severance from gold backing, rendering the dollar pure fiat currency. Only 3 years later, in 1974, when gold was no longer a genuine competitor to the now unbacked dollar, was private ownership finally legalized by President Gerald Ford. Gold was no longer a threat because the monetary discipline it enforced had been destroyed.
Yet, what the public fails to recognize is that the structural mechanisms for confiscation remain fully operational.
Furthermore, the precise macroeconomic conditions that necessitated the 1933 seizure are rapidly reappearing: $36 trillion in U.S. national debt, crippling annual deficits, and decades of debasement that have seen the dollar lose 98% of its purchasing power since 1913.
However, the next move will look different.
Governments today are unlikely to physically seize private gold in the manner of 1933. Physical holdings are too decentralized, kept in vaults, safety deposit boxes, or buried. Instead, modern confiscation will be executed via sophisticated regulatory mechanisms designed to achieve the same result, ensuring you cannot protect your wealth outside the centrally controlled system. Let me show you 4 modern threats that function like confiscation without physically touching your gold.
Modern threat number 1: punitive reporting requirements and taxation.
While physically confiscating gold is difficult, the government can effectively penalize ownership by making it prohibitively expensive and risky through regulation. Currently, gold and silver sales above certain thresholds must be reported to the IRS via Form 1099-B, creating an immediate paper trail. The capital gains tax structure for gold is already punitive, classifying it as a collectible subject to a maximum 28% tax rate, higher than standard investment rates, 20%. To actively discourage gold ownership, the state could simply increase this tax rate to 50% or more, require mandatory reporting for all gold purchases, not just sales, or implement steep annual wealth taxes specifically targeting gold holdings.
These measures achieve confiscation not by seizure, but by economic deterrence and pervasive surveillance. Modern threat number 2: bail-ins and banking controls. In 1933, the goal was to force money into banks. Today, the threat is trapping it inside them through bail-in protocols. A bail-in occurs when a failing financial institution legally confiscates depositor funds, above insured limits, to recapitalize itself and avoid total collapse. This is not hypothetical. It occurred in Cyprus in 2013, where many large depositors lost 40% to 60% of their savings over $100,000. Crucially, the US, EU, and other major economies have formally adopted bail-in frameworks as standard policy. If your funds are frozen or seized within a distressed bank, you cannot withdraw them to purchase gold or any other external asset. The government achieves the same objective, preventing flight from the paper system. Modern threat number 3: central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. This represents the single most dangerous control mechanism, granting governments unprecedented, granular control over every unit of currency. A CBDC is digital money issued directly by the central bank, eliminating commercial banks as intermediaries. Your account would sit directly with the Federal Reserve, making every single transaction transparent and traceable to the government. Every dollar could be programmed with specific rules, such as expiration dates, spending restrictions, or the imposition of negative interest rates. If the state wishes to discourage gold purchases, it can simply program your CBDC wallet to automatically reject any transaction flagged for gold acquisition, or apply a mandatory 90% tax instantly deducted from your balance. Under a CBDC system, the state has no need for physical confiscation. It makes acquiring any form of parallel or competing currency impossible via programmed, centralized restrictions. China has already implemented a digital yuan. Europe is preparing a digital euro for 2026. Modern threat number 4: capital controls during financial crisis. When the inevitable next severe financial crisis strikes, governments will enact capital controls designed to prevent the flight of capital from the country and, more importantly, from the fragile banking system. These controls severely restrict your ability to transfer money across international borders, exchange currency, purchase assets located abroad, or even withdraw substantial amounts of physical cash. During such emergency measures, the government can easily impose outright prohibitions on gold purchases, severely limit the quantities allowed, or halt the movement of physical gold across state lines. This has been repeatedly witnessed in countries like Argentina during currency crises and Greece during the 2015 debt crisis. These 4 modern threats effectively achieve the same outcome as the 1933 confiscation without requiring the physical seizure of assets. They successfully trap citizens within the depreciating paper system, making it either financially unviable or technically impossible to protect personal wealth outside of state-controlled assets. And the conditions for these measures are building right now. The current state of affairs is dire.
the U.S. government's liabilities now stand at a staggering $36 trillion. Annual interest payments alone are nearing $1 trillion. Furthermore, the yearly budget deficit sits at $1.7 trillion and continues its relentless climb. This has placed the Federal Reserve in an excruciating, inescapable trap. Should the Fed aggressively hike interest rates to combat persistent inflation, it risks triggering a systemic collapse of the economy and the fragile banking sector. Conversely, maintaining low rates guarantees the acceleration and embedding of destructive inflationary pressures. Simultaneously, we are witnessing an unprecedented global shift away from the US dollar. The cornerstone of American financial dominance, the Petrodollar system, effectively concluded in June 2024 when Saudi Arabia opted not to renew the long-standing agreement. Nations within the BRICS alliance are actively constructing competing, alternative payment infrastructures. Tellingly, central banks around the world are accumulating physical gold at a velocity unmatched since 1950. These converging factors unequivocally signal the accelerating erosion of legitimacy for the dollar-based global financial architecture. Should the dollar forfeit its reserve currency status, the U.S. government will be plunged into a financial catastrophe far exceeding the trauma of 1933. When this crisis materializes, the government will swiftly implement extreme emergency measures. While these won't involve a formal, outright gold confiscation akin to the past, the outcome will be functionally identical. They will deploy central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, designed to limit transactional freedom. They will impose strict capital controls, effectively barricading money within the banking system. Furthermore, taxes on gold will be dramatically increased, coupled with onerous reporting requirements intended to make physical ownership highly precarious. Finally, failing banks will be bailed in, transforming your insured deposits into trapped equity. The four historical stages of wealth confiscation are set to repeat, merely utilizing advanced technological and regulatory mechanisms. Stage 1, the creation of a crisis. The forthcoming economic collapse will primarily manifest as a dollar crisis, a combination of lost reserve status, sovereign debt default, or runaway hyperinflation. The administration will inevitably frame its subsequent emergency actions as essential steps taken to save the national economy. Stage 2, criminalizing alternatives by restriction. Rather than outlawing gold ownership outright, the government will render it financially and logistically impractical. This will involve using CBDCs to explicitly prohibit gold purchases, utilizing capital controls to block the import of physical metal, and instituting pervasive reporting requirements designed to monitor and record every single transaction. Stage 3, trapping wealth in fragile paper assets. Through bank bail-ins, account freezes, and stringent withdrawal limits, citizens' wealth will be forcibly locked inside the conventional financial system. The overriding objective is to prevent the rapid conversion of paper-denominated assets into tangible, hard assets. Stage 4, aggressive currency devaluation. The government will monetize the debt through massive currency printing, effectively inflating away its liabilities. While the government's real debt burden diminishes, your dollar-denominated assets will suffer a severe, continuous loss of purchasing power. This entire process constitutes the modern iteration of the 1933 confiscation. Although the mechanisms have evolved, the ultimate outcome remains unchanged, a massive, engineered wealth transfer from ordinary citizens directly to the state. Crucially, as was true in 1933, the majority of the population will remain unaware until it is too late to react. In 1933, countless Americans trusted their government and dutifully surrendered their gold, accepting President Roosevelt's assertion that the measure was vital for economic salvation. Conversely, those individuals who resisted, who buried their physical gold or moved it beyond national borders, successfully preserved their wealth. When the metal was later revalued to $35 per ounce and finally made legal to own again in 1974, those resistors were enormously rewarded. The price of gold skyrocketed from $35 per ounce in 1971 to $850 per ounce by 1980, a 41-fold increase from the government's 1933 mandatory purchase price of $20. Those who maintained their holdings throughout the illegal period, often risking imprisonment, were thoroughly vindicated. Meanwhile, those who complied, holding only paper dollars, watched their purchasing power systematically eradicated by decades of inflation. History reliably repeats itself because the core governmental incentives remain immutable.
Confronted by overwhelming debt crises, governments invariably select the path of inflation over politically unpopular austerity measures. They consistently opt to devalue the currency rather than implement spending cuts. Furthermore, they always seek to restrict any asset that poses a viable alternative to state-issued money. Gold stands as the ultimate competitor to fiat currency. When the populace loses faith in paper money, they flock to gold, which immediately exposes the failure and decline of the government's currency. Governments restrict gold, therefore, not because the metal itself is hazardous, but because gold is the ultimate truth-teller regarding paper money's solvency. In 1933, gold signaled that the dollar was dramatically overvalued at $20.67 per ounce. The free market demanded a significantly higher price. By confiscating gold and revaluing it to $35, the government tacitly admitted that the dollar had been inflated all along. Today, gold trades well over $4,000 per ounce. Adjusted for inflation since 1933, that price is equivalent to approximately $130 per ounce back then. The market was desperately trying to inform the government in 1933 that gold was criminally underpriced at $20. The government's response was to silence the market through outright confiscation. When the imminent crisis erupts, gold will once more reveal the profound truth about failing paper currencies. It will glaringly demonstrate that the dollar, the euro, the yen, indeed, all major fiat currencies, are systematically being debased through unrelenting money printing. And governments will attempt, yet again, to suppress gold in a frantic effort to conceal this inconvenient truth. The 1933 confiscation was never fundamentally about coherent economic policy, it was solely about raw control.
The government desperately needed to dictate the financial narrative surrounding the dollar, and gold directly undermined that narrative. Hence, gold was eliminated from circulation. Precisely the same governing logic applies today. When CBDCs are rolled out, when capital controls are imposed, and when gold purchases are subsequently restricted, this will not be based on sound economic strategy. It will be entirely about maintaining systemic control. The government needs you to hold dollars, to keep your capital locked inside the banks, and to participate obediently within the centralized system. If the population universally decides to buy gold, the system instantaneously loses all legitimacy. Thus, the government will make the acquisition of gold difficult, exorbitantly expensive, or altogether impossible. This will not be achieved through formal confiscation, but through the four modern regulatory mechanisms described above. And just like in 1933, the vast majority of people will comply. They will retain their money in banks, accept the CBDC, hold onto paper assets, and ultimately suffer a massive loss of wealth via inflation and devaluation. Only those individuals who refuse to comply, who acquire physical gold before the restrictions hit, and who hold hard assets outside the regulated banking system will be able to preserve their wealth. This is not a mere prediction, it is pattern recognition based on history. The precise financial conditions that necessitated the 1933 confiscation exist again today: unsustainable debt, persistent currency debasement, and a widespread loss of confidence in the monetary system. The four stages of confiscation are demonstrably forming. The crisis is building toward its apex. The technological and regulatory mechanisms for restriction are actively being implemented. The great wealth transfer has already begun. The only remaining unknown is the exact timing. Will the crisis hit in 2 years, 5 years, or perhaps 10 years? The Congressional Budget Office projects that U.S. debt will become structurally unsustainable by 2034, when the debt-to-GDP ratio will exceed 180% and interest payments alone consume the entire federal budget. That point is 9 years away. However, unpredictable external shocks could drastically accelerate the timeline: a major war, a cascading banking crisis, or a severe recession that cripples tax revenue. Any of these could trigger the final crisis much sooner. When the moment arrives, the government will act with shocking speed. Emergency measures will be finalized and implemented over the course of a single weekend. By Monday morning, the foundational rules of money will have fundamentally changed. Just as on March 6, 1933, when President Roosevelt closed all banks with only 48 hours notice, and just as on April 5, 1933, when private gold ownership suddenly became illegal overnight, the next crisis will unfold identically, fast, without advanced public warning, and leaving zero time for preparation. The people who failed to prepare will inevitably ask, why didn't anyone warn us? This is the same anguished question Americans asked in 1933 after they turned in their gold, only to watch the government immediately revalue it 69% higher. The crucial warning is already embedded in the history books. The pattern is crystal clear. The stages are repeating themselves precisely. In 1933, the government confiscated gold, revalued the price, and then inflated the currency. Citizens who held only paper dollars lost approximately 40% of their wealth. Citizens who hid their physical gold or shipped it overseas successfully preserved their wealth. In 2025 and the years beyond, the government will implement restrictions designed to trap wealth inside paper assets, then utilize money printing to inflate those assets away. Citizens who hold only paper instruments will inevitably lose. Citizens who hold hard assets, secured outside the banking system, are the ones who will survive the financial storm. The 1933 confiscation is not ancient history, it happened a mere 92 years ago. People who lived through that period are still alive. Their children and grandchildren remember the stories. And those accounts all convey the same vital lesson: when the government instructs you to turn in your gold to save the economy, the true underlying purpose is to save the government itself, not the economy. And the people who comply will ultimately pay the entire price. If this analysis has shown you how gold confiscation actually works and why this destructive pattern is guaranteed to repeat, subscribe. Understanding the history of confiscation is the necessary first step toward protecting yourself from the next iteration. The 1933 gold confiscation is a historical fact, it is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented law. Executive Order 6102 exists. The Gold Reserve Act exists. The 41-year ban on private gold ownership exists. And the technological and legal mechanisms required to execute it again exist today. They are simply referred to by different names now: CBDCs, bail-ins, capital controls, and pervasive reporting requirements. The fundamental playbook has not changed. Only the tactics have evolved. And those who are capable of seeing the pattern forming now are the only ones who will preserve their wealth when the next profound crisis hits. There was a unique moment in American history when the holding of personal wealth itself became illegal. That moment could very well return, not in the exact same form, but assuredly with the same devastating result: your wealth, your hard-earned savings, and your financial independence seized in the name of mandatory systemic stability. The warning signs are flashing bright red. The stages are clearly forming. The crisis is inexorably building.